As an HR professional, I know that managing HR for a workforce comes with its challenges, and managing a global workforce even more so. Using multiple tools for different countries and employee types complicates everything. Costs go up, efficiency goes down, you get the picture. Deal is here to change that. That's DEEL. Whether you're an enterprise business, a small company, or anything in between, Deal simplifies global team management, payroll, hiring, and more. Deal HR streamlines your global operations with built-in compliance to lower costs and maximize efficiency. With self-service onboarding, new hires can be up and running in minutes. Sign documents, track expenses, and approve PTO in seconds. Plus, with Deal, you can easily oversee global cost reviews, headcount, and more with centralized reporting. Ready to see how Deal HR can transform your global operations for free? Head to Deal.com to book a demo today. That's DEEL.com. Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Traci Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. Thank you so much for being here for another week. And thank you for celebrating with me in my 200th episode last week. So that was really exciting. And by the time we're recording this, it's actually this week. Jena, your episode is going to come out pretty quickly, which is very exciting.
I love it. Well, congrats to you. That's 200 episodes. That's like no joke. You are in it to win it.
Thank you. I know, right? At this point, it's like I'm going to be 85 and still recording.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's been 4 years basically, like this month. So it's been a wild ride, but a lot of fun. So thank you for the celebration. But listen, everyone, we have a very exciting series upon us. We're going to be talking about layoffs these next few episodes. And so I have Jena Dunay with me, who is going to kick off this series about layoffs with us. And we're going to really specifically talk about how to conduct layoffs with dignity and how to recover after them internally. And so these are some topics that we haven't really discussed very specifically on the podcast. So I'm excited to dive in. But let me introduce you first to Jena, who is the founder of Recruit the Employer, an outplacement and career development firm. She started her career out on Wall Street, working in investment banking at the New York Stock Exchange. From there, she spent over 9 years in the learning and development space in a variety of roles, from trainer to chief learning officer at a variety of growing organizations. She has 42,000 plus followers on LinkedIn, hopefully more after this episode launches, is a LinkedIn learning instructor with over 167,000 learners, and has been featured on Business Insider, Forbes, Built in, The Scam, and The Muse. She lives in Franklin, Tennessee with her fellow Pittsburgh native husband, Brent, daughter, Vivian, and sheepadoodle, Hank. And for fun, she's an amateur baker, world-class pickleball loser, and occasional needle pointer. I love it, Jena. Welcome to the podcast.
You got to have fun with those bios, am I right?
It's
like
true.
Sometimes they just can get a little stale. So everybody knows I'm really bad at pickleball, but I still show up to play the game.
You know what? That's okay. That's a great lesson for life. It's like we might not always win, but as long as we're having a little bit of fun, that's a win in itself.
Yes. Now, if my husband starts to try to give me pointers, then we're not having fun.
No.
But if we're just out there to have fun, and if I lose, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I like that. And if your husband loses, that's probably even better.
It's better.
Yeah. That's amazing. One team, one dream in marriage.
Yeah.
That's what I always say. That's amazing. Well, Jena, thank you so much again for joining the podcast. And as I mentioned at the top of reading your bio, this is the start to our Layoff Series, which, we kind of, when thinking about the end of the year with the podcast, we're speaking like as a team, thinking about what is really happening in the world and what feels super relevant. And so layoffs obviously have come up quite a bit. And if you go on Reddit or you go on Twitter, you'll see everyone's talking about layoffs and the job market totally sucking and like all this stuff. So that is why you are kicking off this series for us, because you are, as I would call it, kind of the chief dignity in layoff officer for me. Like you know, when we first started talking, you were sharing some insights that I thought were very untouched. Like there are things that you talk about and things that you do in your role that really, I think, help employers to look at layoffs differently. So why don't we start there? Talk to us about what that means to conduct layoffs with dignity, and maybe it even starts before that. Maybe there's something that kind of kicks off this topic in a better way.
Yeah. Well, one, yes, I'm the layoff lady. I talk about the things that nobody wants to talk about, right? It's the big elephant in the room. We're entering into quote unquote layoff season. There's kind of hiring freeze, especially around election, like after the election, we're entering into what is what I'm calling formerly known. It's not formally known. I'm calling it that. Layoff season, right? So we have a lot of companies that will often lay off right around this time, right around the holidays, unfortunately, right around the turn of the new year when the fiscal year ends for a lot of organizations. And so you're going to see more of that. And I would actually say the best way to start off talking about layoffs with dignity is to take a step back and to start to think, this is HR leaders that are listening to this podcast, right? Let's start to think about what are the company values that you represent in the HR team. And my guess is that the core values of your organization probably involve something around integrity. Maybe there's like high standards of something, right? And so when we're thinking about layoffs, we need to go back to our core values and make sure that we are laying off in the same way that's aligned with our core values, right? A lot of companies really focus on the core values and then like they sit on the shelf and nobody really talks about them, but they are so important and so crucial to attaching it actually not just to the entire, ethos of the culture, but actually to how do we leave people well and how do we make sure we transition them well when they don't really have a choice but to leave, right? And so a lot of organizations spend a lot of time thinking about those wonderful core values at the beginning part of the employee life cycle, the onboarding. But what we like to talk about and recommend for organizations to start to think about is you should be offboarding as well as you onboard if you care about employees, if you care about being generous in the layoff process. And which I think most HR leaders really want to do that. And so that's kind of how I would take that step back is it really starts with the core values. It really starts with the idea that offboarding is just as important as onboarding.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's so interesting that you talk about this too, and in the scope of the election also, because last week for the 200th episode, I talked about how I pretty much didn't agree with this recent report that came out about how 95% of workers who actually were workers polled, and this was one of the big gripes that I had with the report, is that it's like 95% of workers and not 95% of the people that they actually asked.
Right. That's like every statistic everywhere at all times for all reports. So yeah,
it's true.
You're not wrong.
Like, what is happening here? But they said, 95% of people would be looking for a new job. And I was like, that's literally not true. Like we're in the midst of an election year, and this is when people generally feel the most instability, when companies tend to go through the most change or become the most conservative with their either their fiscal plan or their hiring plan, whatever it might be. So I appreciate that you brought that up because I think it really is very relevant. And when we think about layoffs too, and how all of that is related to just like this season and what we're going through at the end of an election year, or at the start of an election year, is that with all of that change, people become much more like they start to feel much more shaky, and they feel a lack of stability. And then there is also, I think, a fear associated, like, are they going to be laid off? Is their job secure? What does that look like? And then you have all of these outside influences where we hear and see people
open up
impacted.
LinkedIn. To your point, you said Reddit, or I don't go to Reddit. That's just a dumpster fire. But LinkedIn has become some of that place, right? Which is you kind of have to be there if you want to then be looking actively for a job. So you make a great point.
Exactly. It's like you have to be there, but then part of you is like, well, I don't want to see all of this because it's making me like a little bit less secure in what's going on. So all of that to say that I 100% agree with what you're saying. And on the offboarding piece, I definitely want to dig in there because I'm sure that there are listeners who have probably never been a part of an offboarding process before. So when you say offboarding, what does that really entail for you?
Yeah. Well, I would just say that there should be a process, period. And I think a lot of organizations don't think about it until they need to think about it, and then it's too late. I'm actually going to read a couple of things that will happen if an employer doesn't think about the offboarding until they have to offboard somebody in a way that they aren't just choosing themselves to leave, that they are being kind of pushed out, for lack of a better phrase. So if you're not thinking about it beforehand, right? Plans are going to be haphazardly pulled together. The exiting employee is going to feel like a number, even if they didn't feel like a number throughout their entire experience. That lasting impression is going to make an impact on them as they're exiting. It's going to dramatically hurt the employer brand, which is this intrinsic thing that we really don't know how to like quantify, but it really does matter in the talent acquisition game. A lot of HR professionals know that. There's also a higher chance of lawsuits that are going to happen if you're not thinking about this stuff strategically and thinking about it proactively. And then obviously for those that are left behind, there's this like survivor's guilt that's going to happen, right? Mm-hmm. And so if it's not communicated effectively, if people don't feel as if they are truly given that soft landing, it's going to have ramifications, not just on the brand, not just on the organization, and obviously on those people that are getting let go, but for those that remain. That's a big thing that a lot of people don't talk about, the loss of productivity that happens. I mean, there's a lot of studies. There's actually just a piece that came out that talked about the cost of layoffs and productivity being one of the main things that's a huge issue, because if people don't feel like they're secure, to your point, they don't have trust in the organization. So there has to be a plan also to rebuild trust, not just, hey, we offboarded these people, hope they're fine, we're going to send them on their merry way. All right, let's just get back to business as normal. It doesn't really work like that. Mm-hmm. And so being able to acknowledge that that's going to be the reality and plan for it proactively is just what we're talking about here. You're not going to solve every problem. There are going to be disgruntled employees. There's going to be people they're going to have that kind of break in trust, but there has to be a rebuild plan in place and a plan to, again, provide a soft landing for those individuals.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, I'm thinking about all of the processes that I've had to go through as an HR professional, right. Whether it's conducting a layoff or having to figure out what that offboarding looks like. I think to your point, there is that cascading of information that is a huge part of the offboarding process. And there's also the operational side of the offboarding process related to that person. Yeah. So it's like there's and you kind of mentioned it in terms of getting all of the plans in place, but really when we think about that almost like tactically for
it's a lot of work.
Who are listening, it's a lot of work. This is not something that can be haphazard. So yes, I think that was the first thing that you said, is that without an offboarding, it is a haphazard process. And when you have a haphazard process, you have so much business risk, like just so much. And so I think about, for those listening who maybe have not been exposed to offboarding processes, for the operational side of things, you have to think about severance agreements and separation agreements, severance amounts, I should say, and what where the person lives, what state requirements might apply in terms of termination pay or final pay or bonuses. Like all of those things are things that have to really be thought about in advance. And I know that there are going to be people who are maybe not in HR or who are in HR and maybe are a little skeptical, who are going to think, oh, well, if you're planning so far ahead, like I should know. The person who's being laid off should know as far in advance versus being told that same day or that same week that is the end of the road for them. But I just think that is potentially looking at things with rose-colored glasses on, because all of these things are operational. They're things that do require planning. They require time and collaboration, most likely with like finance teams and other
legal teams,
exactly, and other people in the business. And as much as it totally sucks to have to either lead a layoff process or to be laid off, there can't always be that abundance in terms of transparency especially because of all of those things that you mentioned also in terms of cascading information. Imagine there's potentially something that falls into the category of a mass layoff and people are notified without all of the plans. Like, what does that do for those people?
Yeah.
It makes
sends them more into a panic.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to have spiraling people that are just spiraling out of control. There's more business risk. And then the individuals who remain in the organization and, to your point, feel potentially some survivor's guilt are probably starting to feel even more shaky in their experiences. So
looking around, I mean, there's a lot of things that happen. And some of the questions that I recommend HR leaders to think about, and again, it's all about having this plan, is like, what kind of communication plan do we have? That one is like the most important piece. How you communicate, what you communicate. To your point, like there is a difference between transparency and oversharing. Like you can be transparent, but not overshare. And I definitely think there's a fine line, and it's often hard for leaders in general, not just HR leaders, to find that fine line. And honestly, it's a case by case basis. I can't tell you like, this is the perfect script for that. I wish I could tell you that. There isn't one. We've seen companies do it really great and some companies where it didn't land as well. And so how are we communicating to employees that are being, that are going through the layoff process? For those organizations, for those people that are going to be left behind, for the public, maybe shareholders, like how are we communicating this to the public, right? And then what is that severance going to look like? Are we going to offer outplacement? Obviously, we're biased because we're an outplacement firm. We really recommend that because it can provide that career transition services, just to provide them with that soft place to ask questions, because the job market has changed, the digital space, even in the last 5 years, it's changed so much. But also, like, what are we going to offer in terms of benefits? How are we going to rebuild trust? Like, what's our plan of action once that layoff is finalized and we have to proceed? Like, what are we going to do to rebuild trust? Because we're going to have to. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when you rebuild trust. So let's get a plan in place. Let's get some things in place to make sure that we're making those people that are left behind feel more secure. And if you have a lot of that stuff in place, when a layoff comes, what feels like fast, which it often does for some people, right? Maybe they, even for senior HR leaders, it's like, oh, we have to do this now. Yes, and if there's not a plan in place, having that contingency plan is just going to help you hit the ground running a little bit easier and make sure it's a little bit more smooth of a transition.
Totally agree. And this is a huge mirror into leadership at an organization too.
Correct.
In terms of how information is cascaded, what that communication plan looks like. And realistically, communication plans, once they're devised and they prove to be well executed, they can just continue to be used for anything that maybe is information that's either good, bad, or in between. It's, pretty agnostic in terms of what the communication is. But for those who may not know or may not have ever used outplacement services, can you expand a little bit more on what that is and what you do?
Yeah, it's so funny. I was at the HR Tech conference at the time of this was like about a month ago. And when I started telling people about outplacement that had no idea of what it was, which I'm actually kind of surprised when I talk to an HR leader that doesn't know what outplacement is. They'll call it outsourcing. I'm like, very different. Very different thing. But they kept on referring to the movie Up in the Air with George Clooney. They're like, oh, you're George Clooney in Up in the Air. I'm like, I am not the person delivering the layoff news. So no, I am not him. Just for clarification. But outplacement, really at the end of the day, and how we specifically look at outplacement, because there's a lot of big box firms that are out there and kind of respect what they are pulling together. But what we really focus on is how do we holistically serve that person who is now a candidate and help them navigate the candidate marketplace, taking back control of their career, building their confidence back up, and ultimately making sure that their marketing materials are in place so that they can apply to jobs effectively, they can interview for jobs effectively, and they feel good about themselves in the process. Outplacement services, in my opinion, should be utilized not just to give somebody a bunch of resume tips and here's some jobs we're going to push to you. You figure that part out. That's what a lot of outplacement firms are like, unfortunately, nowadays. How we really look at it is, how do we first rebuild your confidence? Because it's going to affect everything else in the process, right? We provide everything from the coaching piece to really helping somebody get clarity on what they want to do next, using this as a pivotal point in their career. As a positive thing in their career. We are very encouraging. It's a fun atmosphere. We don't make it sad, like, hey, you got laid off. Here's some sad organization to go to. Like, we'd make it fun, right? And so try to do our best to really uplift people as they're navigating what is a challenging season. It is proven that the top tragedies in a person's life, the most stressful moments in a person's life come down to death of a loved one, divorce, and losing their job. Yeah, it's a big one. And so we really take that responsibility seriously of stewarding those people that are exited and really try to make them alumni of your organization as best as we can as we're transitioning them.
That's fabulous. And it's also so important what you said at the end there, that to make them as best as possible alumni of the organization.
Yeah.
Because you really do, and I think we talked about this the first time we spoke, you really do want people to go out the way they came in. You want them to feel supported. You want them to feel optimistic about the organization, especially some people might be shareholders while they're leaving organizations, even if it's against their will in some ways, right? Like, so you want them to feel still connected to an organization, even if there's negative emotion, obviously, surrounding being laid off. And what you said also around what you do in terms of being stewards for the organization, for those leaving the organization, there is potentially like a softer blow when someone hears that while they are being laid off, and that is one of the most stressful moments of their lives. And I totally can understand that. That then they actually are not just being sent out into the cold, cruel world to figure it out. They're being sent to almost like a middle place, a middle ground that allows them to have resources beyond that experience in that organization.
We're a good kind of purgatory. That's what I always say. You know?
I was thinking that, but I didn't.
We're a good kind of purgatory. You know, we are that middle ground. And you know, I think the thing is too, is we really lead with the empathy. And I'm a person who has been affected by a layoff before. Thankfully, I had an organization that was very generous as they were letting me go. And at the same time, though, and I also wanted to leave the organization. I was going off to do my own thing, to build something. And it still was a huge blow to me personally, even though I was planning to leave and even though they were super generous. But I still have really good feelings towards that organization because they were generous, and towards the leaders, because I know sometimes layoffs have to happen, right? They have to happen. And HR is not always the bad person in that process, right? Most of the time, you're not. Yeah, it's not your fault that you're having to go through this layoff. You just get to do the dirty work, unfortunately. And so we really take that, because I am a practitioner first, because I was somebody who was affected by a layoff. I know those feelings of shame. I know those feelings of, am I actually really good at what I'm doing? Even though they told me I'm really good and they said this has nothing to do with my performance, I still feel like, well, why did my friend not get let go? Right? So the very real emotions that somebody is going through, or like, oh my gosh, everyone's saying that the job market is terrible. It's going to take me forever to find a job. Like, those talk tracks really make a difference. And after doing practitioner work for over a decade of working with people one-on-one, those talk tracks really make a difference in somebody's ability to stay resilient through the process, which is necessary no matter what market we're in. But also, it really affects what jobs they apply for, what they go for, if they negotiate their salary, if they interview well, right? A lot of people haven't interviewed in maybe 5 years or even 2 years. Like, you're rusty, and you don't need a lack of confidence to ruin your chances of landing the job. So we spiff up somebody. We always say, we're like, we just give you an ultimate makeover in your career.
Yeah, I love that. It's really so true. I work with clients on resumes and career coaching, interview prep and stuff like that. And it comes up so often that people have, they could be at executive level and they haven't interviewed in like 15 years and they don't even know where to start. And their resumes haven't even been touched. And you're like, dusting off the cobwebs basically. And it's such a skill. And when you don't use that skill, it becomes a little rusty and you have to kind of like the Tin Man, oil up the joints so that you can get moving again.
Yeah. Nobody utilizes that skill set. I utilize that skill set every day. So I'm used to it and it's easy peasy for me, right? If I had to find a job for whatever reason, I could find a job really quickly because I use those skills all the time. It is insane for a company to think that, they can just figure it out, because it's not that easy to just figure it out. And especially in the digital world that we live in. And like, how robust should my LinkedIn profile be? How much information? Right. I mean, all those logistical questions, we're a soft place to answer those. And no stupid question. There's no stupid question, right? Yeah. Because you don't practice it. It's not your fault that you don't know that. And it's also not your fault your college never taught you. So like we, putting aside therein, but we really help make sure that person feels equipped, because it really does make a difference. So I would really encourage an HR leader to push for that. Within their the team that's involved with deciding what those packages look like. And I would also say that when choosing an outplacement provider, make sure that they really have one really great strategist or coaches that know what's up and that aren't antiquated with their strategies. There's a lot of firms out there that provide antiquated strategies, that there is some personalization involved, and that the person isn't just getting like shoved to the side, but they don't feel like a number. That the outplacement firm actually makes them feel seen and known.
Yeah, I can imagine that is extremely critical, considering you're going from such an impactful moment in their lives to then wanting to feel supported and seen and heard and all of those things.
Don't just check a box. It's better for you to use that money. If you're just checking a box, use that money towards their severance, honestly.
Right.
But if you're really trying to be intentional with finding a provider that's going to make sure that they feel supported throughout, that is something that's worthy of investing in.
Yeah. I'm glad you bring up this point too, because we've talked a lot about what it is like and the importance also of going through these layoff processes and making sure that they're really thoughtful and that that dignity is at the core of all of this. And then, as you've just mentioned, there's also this tactical piece for HR leaders in leveraging different, I don't want to call them perks, but basically providers that do support exiting employees with what I guess we could categorize as a benefit to their exit.
Correct.
And that is like an outplacement service. And so for those listening, effectively what they would need to do is really think about all of their benefits and their full benefits package from start to finish in the employee life cycle. And so that then when they have a layoff process, because every organization at some point goes through some sort of layoff process, it's kind of inevitable, then they have already thought about what their resources and what their extended benefits will be for those individuals. So I guess it would be safe to say that you would recommend that they think about that before they go through the layoff process.
Yeah, because you want to be thoughtful in your vetting and not just use perhaps who you've always used, which I think a lot of companies do. And that's fine, but I would use it as an encouragement to like reevaluate who your provider is and what they're really providing for those exiting employees. And are they truly making them alums of your organization, or are they just kind of giving them a bunch of resume tips and like sending them on their merry way? There's a difference, right?
Of course.
There's a difference in kind of thinking about the person in that way.
Right. That totally makes sense. And I think just to kind of come back to one of the other things that we mentioned at the top of the podcast, which is what to do when the rest of the organization may feel survivor's guilt. How would you recommend leaders, whether they're in HR or not, navigate this common feeling amongst employees that are retained and remain in the organization? And what is the best way for kind of dealing with and approaching that situation?
Yeah, there's no one size fits all. I think it really depends on how, again, what was your communication plan? Like what are we trying to remedy here? Right?
Right.
There's different levels of trust that we have to rebuild depending on how well it's planned out. But what I would say in general that I've seen work for organizations, and again, you're going to have some rockiness. It's going to happen. So there's no way to fully solve for it and be like, if we do these XYZ 3 things, then your organization is going to be fine. Everyone's going to be happy-go-lucky and you're going to lose no productivity. Like that is illogical and it's not human, right? We're in human resources. So that is not human because people have emotions. And so I think providing space for people to have those emotions, for having channels of communication up and down, for people to really, for the leaders to really be honest about their mistakes. It's kind of like parenting, right? So I have a daughter, she's 20 months old. I have another one on the way. And thank you. Yeah. And I'm thinking about when she's a teenager, if I am not modeling for her what it looks like to apologize, how can I expect her to show, you know what I'm saying? So like with leaders, it's taking ownership of what your responsibility was and why this is happening. Because at the end of the day, even if economic climates, whatever, the people at the top still have some of that responsibility and should own that, be honest about that. A great example of somebody who did this was during 2020, and it was actually Airbnb. Now, I don't know how Airbnb has handled layoffs post that, but you know, people can have their opinions. But for this specific one, the leader wrote a really beautiful letter to the employees, wrote a really beautiful letter to the public and explained what he went wrong and where the leadership went wrong and what they're doing to kind of remedy that for the future. They just put some great plans in place. So like the ownership piece, right, I think is super, super important during this season. So that's the first thing for leaders. Now, you as an HR person can recommend that to the senior leadership. They have to really own that for themselves. But that is like the first step, is owning leaders to own their mistakes in the process. The second thing that I would say is, again, that communication up and down, providing opportunities for people to express their emotions that they're going to naturally feel. And then I would also say some team building that happens especially between C-suite leadership that kind of really made the decision and that middle management. Because if the middle management is feeling rocky, their teams are going to feel rocky, which means your whole company is going to feel rocky.
Totally.
And so there needs to be some sort of either workshops done or communication plans in place, like really, really trying to bridge the gap between senior leadership and middle management, I think is a really great strategy. We do workshops around that to help companies post layoff with that exact thing. But that's something to really consider. And then generally speaking, I'd say the other part of it is really like, how do we rebuild culture? So going back to those core values that we talked about at the very beginning, how can we put some fun things in place to bring some levity to the mood, to thank the people that are left behind, to encourage them that their jobs are safe, which hopefully they are,
right.
And which we don't know, right? They might not be, but still to provide that encouragement that, hey, if this does happen, this is how we handled it. We believe this is a really great strategy that we did use. We did think thoughtfully about it. Didn't just happen like happenstance. And then just to provide those opportunities for people to rebuild their culture in the way that they would if they were starting over new. It's kind of like a new company happens every time a layoff happens. So acknowledging that and rebuilding the culture from the ground up is something that needs to be thought about.
Yeah, I think that's awesome, and super appreciate you going through some of these like tactical, tangible things that leaders can really think about, because as we discussed at the top of this, it is kind of a time for a lot of change and a lot of worry and fear of the unknown. I mean, we're upon the election in a few weeks. And so I just feel like every 4 years this comes up. It's like, even though layoffs happen throughout the year and of course, pretty much on the regular, we know that there are things at a macro level that do affect the way that people feel at work and the level of security that they feel at work. So all of those things that you've talked about and all of those realities in terms of how leaders need to plan appropriately and responsibly to make this process as effective and dignified as possible is so important. So thank you so much for walking us through that and giving us all of your expert insights and tips and all of that. And so I guess we'll close with allowing the listeners to understand where they can learn more about you and your company and how they can hopefully get connected if they're interested in bringing outplacement services of yours to their own company.
Yeah. So the best places is our website, recruittheemployer.com. And then also my personal, I would love to meet you if you're a listener of this and you feel, even just if you're like, that made me think, that would be a fine response. Not like, hey, we should set up a call and I need your outplacement services. Just like, hey, that made me think. If you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn, you can find me at Jena Dunay. I live there, I breathe there, I doom scroll there, right? So I am there all the time and would love to meet you and just encourage you also as an HR leader, because your job's hard and your job's been really hard for the past couple of years, honestly, since COVID. And so just to send you some encouragement as well, that, there will be good news. And in case there's bad news, we're here to help.
Amazing. Jena, thank you so much again for your time and all of your expert knowledge on this topic.
Thanks for having me, Traci. Love being here.
Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.